Hi guys. This is actually my last lecture because this is the last required week of class. As I said before, I've moved the moot court to entirely voluntary. Entirely voluntary. Please do get in touch if you'd like to participate. If we have a quorum, I'll organize that according to our time zones and availability and things like that. So I'm going to talk about the documentary and a little bit about what I think false confessions can tell us about the criminal justice system in general. Then I'm going to talk a little about what to do if you ever get stopped by the police, because you should get something concrete out of this. And I'll have a few wrap-up comments at the end. I'm also going to upload a short optional lecture. If you all remember when I talked about the Black Death and sort of what I study more generally, I think the 8:30 class actually was canceled that day, but I talked a little bit about the inapplicability of the Black Death to coronavirus, and I think there's more to be said about that now. So I'll include an optional short lecture if you're interested in a separate video. So this week again focused on false confessions, not just because obviously they're an important problem with the legal system, but also because I think these documentaries, because they go through each step of an actual case, they give you a better view of the criminal procedure in general than we get by studying Supreme Court cases, however interesting they are. These cases, I think, show the mechanics of how it all actually works. And in this one in particular, I think we really got a sense of how the adversarial system thinks and some of the difficulties of having a system meant to achieve justice that is fundamentally premised on combat, basically, and competition. So, as one of the people interviewed put it, quote, "No prosecutor or detective wants to believe they've ever put someone behind bars who was innocent. So if they put you behind bars, they sort of have to think that you're guilty for their own sort of self-validation." So I think that's one of the many issues with an adversarial system, although in many ways I feel like it's the sort of best option. So in this case, four Navy men not only falsely confessed to a brutal rape and murder. I think the really fascinating difference with this is that they made up a series of details. They all made up these graphic and horrifying details to go along with their false confessions. And one of them, Joe Dick, came to believe that he actually had committed this rape and murder. And then when the actual culprit was found and the DNA matched, they still went to trial and were convicted. You probably noticed the sort of snowballing effect here, right? So the way it began was that Williams confessed, but turns out it didn't actually match what happened. So they got the autopsy report back and it didn't match his confession. So the detective went back to Williams and basically told him to change it to fit the details. And then the DNA came back and it didn't match him. So instead of throwing out this confession, they kept the results secret and found new people to bring into the story. So there's that sense of we can't undo anything that has already been done. We have to just keep on moving forward as though we had done it correctly the first time. So we have a strong sense, I think, of what one of the people interviewed, Peter Brooks, talked about, that innocence can defend itself. If you ask for a lawyer, you look guilty. Even Fasanaro, who was Joe Dick's attorney, who I hope to God was sued for malpractice, says that he didn't go with Joe to his interrogations because his presence could hinder Joe telling the truth. So what began as an interrogation then became a confession, which once it was made could not be gone back on. It just continued to sort of spawn new and sort of more outrageous attempts to get more evidence that might eventually fit the actual story of what happened. And one of the valuable things I think about this documentary is they do talk about how, all the lawyers say, no one in Virginia believes that you would confess to a murder that you didn't commit. And that goes for juries, judges, lawyers. So just to put some questions for you to answer below. One is sort of the obvious one. Why didn't they just throw out Daniel's confession, the original confession, when they discovered either that the autopsy didn't match or that the DNA didn't match? So why keep going? In the end, 4 men confessed committing the crime together, including men who didn't really know each other, and then the DNA matches none of them. So what was the logic that sort of held together the case against them? I'd also be interested in hearing how you think this documentary compared to the Adrian Thomas one, because they're quite different. The Adrian Thomas one shows footage of interrogation, so it gives you that sort of immediate sense of how the interrogation goes forward. This one gives you a lot more sort of backstory, and this was a trial that went on for a long, long, long time, involved many more players. So you get a much fuller sense of how the justice system worked. And I'd just be interested to hear which one had a bigger effect on you and why. And then the other question I had was something I didn't talk about, but how did the death penalty, or rather, the threat of it, inflect everything in this proceeding? Because it kept coming up. I'm sure, as you know this, that Virginia is a death penalty state, that death was on the table. Do you think things would have turned out the same if it hadn't been? Do you feel like the death penalty entered here a little bit? It's something we haven't talked about in class, but it came up in this documentary, and I think it's interesting. And just about, I wanted to address something that came up last week about false confessions. And one of the reasons I didn't really do lectures in class, even though I kind of have to now that we're online, is because for the most part, I think it's really crucial that you think through all of these issues yourselves, and that I don't unduly influence your perspective when it comes to ethics and justice, both because I think it's unethical to do so, but also because I don't think that someone lecturing to you about ethics and justice is actually a useful thing. But one of the things I wanted to put in my 2 cents on, take it or leave it, was, I think, an understandable sense in comments that I've noticed and in discussions, that who these men were, these former Navy men and Adrian Thomas, that there was something about them that made them particularly susceptible to false confessions and to the justice system in general. So things like their lower levels of education, although among the Navy men that's variable, any history of mental illness, even something like depression. So just sort of generally who they were. Adrian Thomas was unemployed, things like that. I understand wanting to attach their false confession to their identity, because in the face of some pretty horrifying possibilities, it makes it feel better if it couldn't happen to us. And I'm not trying to at all make you feel bad for that impulse. I think also, depending on who you are and the people you grew up around, these men might seem far from your life and from your experience. I just wanted to point out that that's right in some ways and it's wrong in some. I think it's right that a social position that coincides with high levels of education does protect you from this position in a lot of ways. You're more likely to know how to get a lawyer. You might even know one. You're more likely not to feel intimidated by a police officer because you're less likely to have had repeated adverse interactions with police that left you feeling vulnerable. In short, you're in a relatively higher position of power vis-a-vis the police than these men are. But I think that shouldn't be confused with the knowledge that an education gives you. So something we talked about last Friday was that before this class, most of you would probably have said that you were educated, didn't have a legal education, but were educated. I don't know how many of you would have known that you have to claim your right to remain silent in order to remain silent. So that's something that you learned in this class, despite being educated beforehand. So it's not actually a matter of knowledge. I think that's an easy thing to confuse. One of the things that higher social status in our society in general affords you is protection from the experience of just raw hierarchy, in which someone exercises their absolute power over you and you are completely vulnerable. This is sort of the issue with adverse police interactions. And if you haven't experienced that, it's almost impossible to describe it or to even believe that it exists. Though I think these two documentaries do a pretty good job of helping you through it. I think if you are able to sympathize with Adrian Thomas and to feel yourself in his position, I think it can be a visceral sort of experience of that. The interrogation room and interactions with the justice system in general are a microcosm of that exercise of power. And so, yes, I think we're all somewhat protected from finding ourselves in these positions, not because we know more than these men do, or that we are stronger than they are. And I think once there, I don't know that we can predict how we might react to the most stress that we've ever experienced, probably under conditions that are causing us real grief, like for Thomas, for 10, 16, 24 hours on end with someone yelling in your face, deliberately twisting your words where you're not free to leave or even move without permission. We all like to think of ourselves as strong people, but power is power. And I think it does a disservice to these men to think that one would have to be weak to succumb to it as they did. As the NYPD detective in the documentary bragged, lots of people say they'd never confess to something they didn't do. I'll tell you something, put them in a room with me, I could do it. So that's just my sort of 2 cents on distancing ourselves from these experiences or feeling that these men were somehow particularly susceptible to it. I think in some cases, like with Joe Dick, that was true, but Joe Dick was not the only one. So just to be a little bit careful about how we associate weakness with their false confessions. Anyway, so since this is the last lecture, I feel like I wouldn't be doing my civic duty if I didn't tell you this. We've talked about it in office hours, but what to do if police stop you. In about half of the states, North Carolina is not among them, but in about half of them, this is easily Googleable, you are required to give your name. But other than that, in the rest you're not. Other than that, do not answer any questions. And this is very difficult because, as we've talked about, you're sort of trained to think that silence is guilt and innocence will protect itself. But do not answer any questions. If they ask if they can look in your car or your bag, they are looking for consent, so say no. Otherwise, it's fair game. They might still search it, and you can't stop them. Don't try to stop them. But you've registered your denial of consent. And you should ask, am I free to go? And if you are, leave silently. If you're not free to go, then you are under arrest, and they will Mirandize you. Say that you understand. Say that you are exercising your right to remain silent. Ask for a lawyer, and then say nothing until you can talk to a lawyer. And that's the best possible approach to it. And obviously, if they behave differently than you expect, or they try to goad you into talking, it's going to be difficult to keep to that, but this is the best possible way to approach it. And obviously, do everything courteously and quietly and keep your hands in sight and low to your body. But so don't be aggressive about this, but do not say anything. I hope that's clear from these past 2 weeks that's the best thing to do. Okay, so that's sort of the end of the content part of this lecture. My department has asked you to remember to do your course evaluations on Duke Hub. I'm sure this is sort of the furthest thing from your mind, but it's helpful for departments to keep tabs on how their classes are going and on professors and things like that. So to end, I usually like to end my classes with some random college advice because it came out of talking to my best friend about what we wish we could go back and tell our college selves, and not sort of the like try out new things, take risks, stuff they do tell you, stuff I feel like we worried about in private. And I said to her that I wish I could go back and tell my college self what I know now. And she said, well, you can do that. You can tell your students. So take this or leave it. I'm not your mom. Here are some things that I wish I'd known. First, and I feel like this is especially applicable now, everyone tells you that college is the time of your life. It'll be your best years. You'll make your best friends. You'll never want to leave. And maybe that's totally true all the way through, and that's great. But I'd like to also say that it's okay that it's okay if it's not. It's okay when things interrupt it. College is like any other time of life. There's sadness and fear and disappointment and bad relationships, and it's okay if you're not delirious with the nectar of joy and youth all the time. You're not doing something wrong, and you shouldn't feel guilty for wasting these years. They are what they are. And similarly, I see all these social media posts about the amazing things that people have accomplished in quarantine. I just like to say that the examples they give, Newton and Shakespeare had full-time servants who were literally keeping them alive. And they weren't venturing alone into a destroyed economy as young people. So if you can use this time that way, that's great. But this is not the moment to experiment on yourself. Try to do what you know is good for you. And this might mean allowing yourself to use time differently and maybe not think of all unapplied time as wasted. This isn't your fault. And framing time that you now use differently as wasted, I think makes it seem as though it is. And also, there's so much pressure to find a career path that will be fulfilling, that you love, that contributes to the world, that's significant. What else? That makes you happy all the time, that gives you the life you want, that uses all of your talents, that pays you well. That's a lot for a job to do. It's okay if your career only does a couple of those things. Your career doesn't have to do your life for you. It just has to make it possible. And that might mean something different than what you imagined coming into college, and that's totally fine. Another thing I wanted to mention, sort of off topic, is that if any of you are interested in the Rhodes Scholarship, I'd love to talk to you about it. I was one back in the day. It has its pros and cons like any experience. But I also really wanted to put out there that there's no type for scholars, and that I really hadn't considered applying until like literally 2 weeks before the application was due, because I didn't consider myself the type. So I think the type really is people who want to make a meaningful change in the world, and I'd be happy to talk to you about what that could look like for you if you're interested. You also should really want to go to Oxford if you want to do it, because it's a scholarship in and of itself, but it's mostly another educational experience. On a sort of slightly related note, when I was in college, I always thought that I was asking for a huge favor when I asked my profs for recommendations, and it made me so nervous. Don't be. A professor's job is broken into research, teaching, and mentoring, so it's literally part of our job description. And I just wrote a recommendation for someone I taught 4 years ago, and I remember her like she was in this class. So we remember you. Don't hesitate to get in touch long after the fact. I'm going to miss you all, so please keep in touch if you want. I've told a couple of you, but this is my last semester at Duke, and it's really been an honor and a joy having you all as my last students. I'm going to miss you all so much. So I'd love to hear what you're up to this summer, going forward, and of course I'd be happy to write recommendations for any of you. I'll put my personal email on Sakai so that you can keep in touch. Okay. Take care, guys.